good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm very excited today to have this conversation. My name is Monica Sasso. I am from Red Hat. I'm on our global financial services team, and I look after all things operational resilience, as well as lead our asset and wealth management business. I'm really, I'm going to say this again, excited about having this conversation about operational resilience, all about elevating resilience in financial services with my two colleagues, Anne and Chris. But before I hand over to them to introduce themselves, resilience is a topic that we're hearing everywhere in all industries. But actually what resilience is at the core is it's all about having the ability to absorb shocks and bounce back from these shocks. So in order to do that, we need to plan and practice for failure and understand the impacts of uncertainty and risk in our operations and specifically in our technology operations. So we're going to explore these topics today. It's going to be difficult for us to keep this to 30 minutes because I know the three of us are super passionate and super knowledgeable about this topic. And well, I hope we're knowledgeable on this topic. So if I can hand over to yourselves, Anne and Chris, to Anne to introduce yourself, and then over to you, Chris, and then we'll kick off with the conversation.
Thanks, Monica. So likewise, super pumped to be here today. Delighted to have the opportunity to talk about this with you. I'm Anne Leslie. I'm a Cloud Risk and Controls leader for IBM Cloud for Financial Services, and I cover the EMEA region.
And hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me on for this. So I'm Chris Redmond. I'm Director for Cloud Operational Resilience, Data and AI as part of Promontory. If you haven't heard of Promontory, we are, if you like, the risk and regulatory specialist part of IBM Consulting. And so we do a lot around operational resilience.
Super, and I think operational resilience is a topic everywhere, right? Even though there's laws in certain jurisdictions, and Chris, you and I are in the UK, and Anne, you're in Paris on the continent. These things matter everywhere in every jurisdiction. So even though yes, we're going to be talking specifically about the UK and the EU, this is something that is relevant in every jurisdiction. Full stop. Okay, so I'm going to kick things off with Chris, and this is going to be a test for everybody here. Is Monica keeping to time? Chris, I know when our last one-on-one, you mentioned to me that you just led a workshop with leaders from banks within the UK, or I guess financial institutions within the UK around operational resilience, and you wanted to understand what their big focuses for their priorities for 2025 were. And I think that would be a really great way to start things off. So what is actually defining the shape of operational resilience 2.0 now that we're kind of live with some of these laws?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was a great workshop. Everyone has been really just trying to get across that line for 31st of March. I think it's been probably quite similar in terms of DORA with January. And Anna, if you probably give your flavor on this one as well. But when we were listening to everyone, I think there were 5 key focus areas that people are really looking for, because the regulators are expecting, continued dynamic compliance, but also really, the world is changing, and how do you stay up to date with that, and how do you increase your sophistication? So to increase the sophistication, what we heard from leaders is really operational resilience management information, so MI. That's really thinking about it from the level of the board and the senior management, because you'll find this with all regulators want to make sure that operational resilience is a core consideration strategically for firms and FMIs. So how do you know? And that MI is really, really important. The stressed exits, so business continuity and stressed exits in the context of material arrangements or critical arrangements with third parties, and you're also trying to think about fourth parties as well. But particularly with third parties, what happens at the very, very pointy end, after all your controls, not after all your preparation, the disruption is so bad that you actually lose a material third party. What would you do about that to be able to continue to deliver your important business services or your critical functions? Scenario testing. People have been doing a lot of scenario testing, but continued sophistication, moving from tabletop into simulation, going from simulation to trying to think about live, not just doing this for security, but trying to think about all types of disruption. And that also ties back into the stress testing. I think the other two areas, which we'll not focus on probably so much today, but they're worth thinking about because they tie into these other areas, is resilience by design. So how do you architect for resilience? And also change risk management, which is absolutely core because change is the #1 form of disruption when it comes to operational resilience. So how do you manage change effectively?
And I mean, Chris has given us quite a lot here. I suspect it's a similar story for you.
Absolutely. There's a lot of similarity between the UK and, like you pointed out, the broad policy objective around operational resilience. I don't think there's much divergence globally. How it's being implemented and where the focus is, yes, there are jurisdictional flavors. And even with DORA, we are likely to see with a common rule book that different emphasis may be put slightly differently by different national competent authorities. What I'm noticing perhaps as a slight divergence between DORA and how it's been implemented by the firms that are in scope for it compared to the UK. Now, this is anecdotal, right? So don't take this as scientific fact. It's just my gut sense of what I'm seeing, is that DORA is, at least now in the early stages of implementation, maybe not quite as coupled to the business as it is in the UK. The focus in the UK of avoiding customer harm, for example, immediately makes it a business conversation. It's implicit in DORA. It's not as explicit, and what that means is that it may not have the same level of impetus coming from the business. I say that without judgment. It's not a criticism. Principle-based regulation essentially leaves latitude to firms to decide what is the best way for them to reach the outcome. So each firm is charting its own course. Again, though, anecdotally, what I'm seeing is that when there is a really strong executive mandate, and often that's coming from somebody who has the influence and the authority and a certain legacy and heritage in IT, but is being elevated to a role where resilience is the thing, it's driving more pace, more traction, and a better level of conversation where IT and risk and security and the business and the board are building up a different level of connective tissue where the conversations aren't easy. They are long in a lot of cases, trying to get a shared view of what matters most and what are we willfully going to put to one side, not because it's unimportant, it's just in this context less important. Those are the minority, but I have a feeling that we are going to see that they manage to actually drive better outcomes, not only from a regulatory compliance perspective, but also in terms of driving value from their investment and seeing that there are benefits to the business. They're approaching it with more strategic vision, arguably a bit more enlightenment about where resilience will fit into strengthening themselves. It's not that it's wrong. I don't ever like criticizing and saying people are doing things wrong by approaching compliance as a tick box. I understand why that happens. Organizations are complex. Every organization has its own level of dysfunction. And I think what DORA is revealing is the cracks that were already there. And where organizations are finding operational resilience difficult, it's because there is a legacy of things that were done imperfectly in the past. And DORA is requiring that we dust them all off and realize, oh, to actually get to the baseline of where we're meant to be to get better, we have some cleanup to do. Documentation that might be missing. Process documents that were never written. The enterprise architecture that doesn't actually exist in a single place in a single form. All of these kind of artifacts and that level of clarity about what is the lie of the land? What are we starting from? People are realizing that the lie of the land that they actually have, the reality of it is not what they thought they had. And just that level of cleanup, I think, has slowed a lot of firms down and frustrated a lot of people and discouraged a lot of people But we have to actually move beyond that and say we need to do the best we can with what we have, where we are. And we often look to technology to fix these things. I actually think there's a massive element of we have to make peace with not fighting reality and being willing to entertain the discomfort and straddle it and just say, it is messy right now, but it's going to get better. However, fighting it is only ever going to waste more energy, and nobody has energy to waste.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, Anne. And this is where then we kind of cross the lines between science and art, isn't it? But first of all, can you guys hear me and see me? Okay, maybe not. So
we can see
this
you.
kind of then, okay, perfect. Thank you. But listening to what you said, and again, you know, the three of us have had these conversations together and independently, probably ad nauseum, and experienced this ourselves, having worked in with and for some of the major financial services firms. But this kind of begs the question, right? Then how do you start to prove that you're resilient, and not even necessarily to the regulators, but also to yourselves, and define that? And I think this kind of goes back to the number one point that you made, Chris, in the beginning about operational resilience, MI. You know, how can firms prove that either they're this work in progress, as Anne has kind of alluded to, but also then all the reporting that they need to prove back to the regulators? How is that? I'd love to hear your view on that, Chris, since you were with all those execs and that was the big topic.
So I think there's a couple of things to pick up from what Anne has called out already. You know, so I think when we talk about the connective tissue that's growing, if you like, maybe in new ways, between IT, business, going from ground level up, people who are working hands-on keyboards almost, for example, all the way up to around the boardroom, C-suite, thinking about that how people are, it's going from that connective tissue to new muscle memory, I think is the way I would put it. And it is sometimes a painful process, but because it's a learning process. But that learn piece is really, really important. So if I pull back to the UK's definition of operational resilience, which you'll find in the international BCBS ones as well, which is it's the ability of firms and FMIs and the sector as a whole to prevent, respond, recover, and learn from disruptions. That learn piece is absolutely critical. And it's learning to go from the implicit and the inherent, which you'll find is a lot of people, of course, I always think about, I want to be resilient, especially from a technology perspective. We've been thinking about RTOs, we've been thinking about RPOs for so long. We've had business continuity before. This isn't new. Well, actually, a lot of the elements are existing, but they're being brought together in new ways. And how do I show that explicitly? How do I evidence how I am learning, and how do I evidence that resilience? And I think this really comes together in terms of how do I, and again, in the UK, we've got this, the senior managers regime. So we're thinking about the SMF 24, typically the COO, the CIO personally have on the hook for resilience. Right. And you've also got similar requirements in terms of DORA, in terms of that senior executive. But the board is ultimately responsible for the management of risks and for resilience. And the PRA, for example, have been very clear in the Dear CEO letters. You need to show us that operational resilience is, if you're only really seeing operational resilience coming to you with a self-assessment once a year, you're not doing it right. The firms and FMIs who are doing this really well, they've got this as part of a dashboard, and they're able to show and they're able to and know. Again, coming back to what Anne was saying, it's about trade-offs and prioritization and staying on top of that dynamically, because the world changes all the time. So that's why operational resilience leaders really put a lot of emphasis on the operational resilience MI, because they are trying to report up to the board, because the board will want to know, well, how are you, as an oversight perspective, How are you keeping the firm resilient? What choices do we need to make? How are we investing to remediate vulnerabilities, for example? And then what is happening to the important business services? Because the IT assets, for example, if we think people, process, technology, information facilities, and outsourced arrangements, they're supporting important business services or critical functions. That's facing out into end users, into counterparties. And that world is constantly changing. It's a complex, dynamic risk environment. We know it from security, but we also know right now the world is changing. There's a lot of volatility out there, for example, in the markets. That is changing a lot of the assumptions that have gone into identifying important business services or critical functions, into identifying impact tolerances. How do I know that that world, if, for example, we're hearing from world leaders that the world has changed, the world as we knew it is not the same world anymore, and it's changing so rapidly, what does that mean for my MI? What does it mean for my important business services? Have I prepared to become resilient for something that I no longer need to be resilient to? Or, are there new threats? Are there new risks? So if we think about that, I think I come back to the context is key. And I think I would always come back to I think it's brilliant, the Financial Policy Committee's paper on their macroprudential approach. So the Bank of England's macroprudential approach to operational resilience. It focuses from a financial stability perspective, but it's a really helpful framework. It looks at MI, thinking about internal disruption. So your risks crystallizing to your people, process, technology, information facilities. It thinks about your third-party disruption. So how will that come through? And fourth parties. And then external shocks. And we're seeing external shocks happening at the moment. We're seeing that, and that will then have implications. But it's really important when we think about resilience overall, it is actually composed of operational resilience and financial resilience together. So how do those two come together? How does that MI help you to understand the interplay between internal, external shocks and disruptions to understand whether or not you're resilient or not? And it's really important that that interaction between operational contagion, financial contagion, and losses of confidence, that board members and C-suite are really able to understand how that then translates and the decisions that they need to make, those trade-offs, those prioritizations. That's what you really need to know if you're going to be shock-proof.
And it's interesting, shock-proof. I don't think anybody's ever going to be shock-proof, because I think let's just be realistic, right? But it's interesting because all of these, that number one, 100% context is key. But all of these things disrupt the supply chain, right? And that ultimately has a knock-on effect to financial stability, not only within each of our countries where we live in, but as the wider system. And I think that then leads easily into the number two item on the list, right? Which was about the stressed exits. And I think, I've had conversations with clients already that are asking me these questions. So they've gone from kind of, look, we have all these tick boxes of where we're managing risk, to now, how do we do a stressed exit? Oh, we haven't thought about all of the other stuff that, you two, Chris and Anne, have already talked about. They haven't built up the connective tissue. They don't have that muscle memory. I love that muscle memory piece. I use it quite a lot. I make analogies to this opera's, marathon to actually running and training for a marathon, right? You have to have stuff in the muscle memory. But I've been having conversations about it. I know, Anne, you've been having conversations about it with some of your clients in the EU. And a lot of them have been specifically asking about how they exit a certain technology like now. So that almost as a response to these shocks that you've just kind of talked about from the macro point of view, Chris, are you seeing the same thing within the EU? And I'd love to kind of understand the trends that you're seeing emerge specifically from the EU lens, because even though we can talk about Brexit and different regimes, right? How wide is the channel? It's not very long, so we all operate kind of together. So I do think it's important to get both lenses.
So yeah, I am seeing similar things. Maybe again, a slightly different focus. The timelines have been a bit different between the UK and what's required for the European Union. That point that Chris made about context being key, I think we can't overstate that. So all of those points about macro-prudential policy, financial stability, absolutely crucial. How often does that actually permeate an organization from the chief economist level, the board level, the C-suite, the chief risk officer, down into the people who, and I don't mean down in any sense derogatory, it's just they're at a different level. Do they ever get that context of where their decisions, their behaviors, their actions in their roles actually contribute to that? Because that's where this thing breaks. I have never heard anybody argue against the principle of more resilience, ever. People will say it's hard, but nobody has ever said it's not necessary. The people who do advocacy, lobbying, the people who are involved in policy work, they're not actually the people who implement this. And that's that gap of understanding about how a technology choice, how DevSecOps, for example, something like that actually is a behavioral choice that contributes to making this real. When it gets delegated down into IT, how many people in any shape or form would be able to draw a line to what they choose to do day to day, not because they're stupid, just because they haven't been given that context of what you're doing is a behavior along with all of your colleagues and those different teams in the organization is contributing to making this real. We don't give them that context. We need to, because when there's resistance, again, people very rarely argue against a noble cause, right? Nobody's going to say, I want to be on the side of causing customer harm. But they're not always going to see that their choices might result in that. So I think we need to re-emphasize that and give people more context, because it will help with bringing this into sort of permeating all the levels of the organization, and particularly the levels of the doers, who are the people who ultimately make it real. When we're talking about stressed exits, I've had conversations with people who are just fatigued, saying, oh, one guy in particular, he'd written a 600-page exit strategy from a hyperscaler. And I said, wow, well done, big achievement. And he went, yeah, it's the most elaborate, beautiful piece of fiction I've ever worked on in my career. And that's the thing, is that yes, we do need to plan. Like, stressed exits are a thing, and there are external shocks that make them necessary. I'm not denying that. But we need to make sure that there's still an element of reality. And what this guy was essentially saying is, I want to work on things that feel substantive. I want to feel that my time and my energy is working on something that might actually happen. And that if we did need to put this playbook into play, it would actually have a chance of stacking up. I think the talent and the energy of a lot of practitioners right now is being channeled into things that look great in PowerPoint, and that they're being passed off as good enough. But when push comes to shove, something realistic, imperfect is a hell of a lot better than something polished and totally unpragmatic. And again, it comes a lot of it down to culture. It's like, are we willing to entertain less than perfect? Are we willing to entertain the uncomfortable mess? And not all organizations are. There are still organizations who are preferring the polish and the veneer and the let's hope nothing breaks, as opposed to the people who are going, we don't know the answer to this, but we think this actually could happen. This plausible but extreme scenario, it might come to pass. And if we found ourselves with our backs against the wall and we had to pull something out of the hat, what would we do? And that requires a lot of leadership candor, quite a lot of vulnerability. And there's that element of we're all together in the trenches. And we are going to have to figure it out. And it mightn't look good on PowerPoint, but we had this conversation, for example, about the CrowdStrike thing that happened in 2024. Nobody planned it, but some firms came out of it better than others. Some firms actually wasn't planned, but they got a chance to practice. And they realized that, oh, okay, it was messy, it was uncomfortable, but whew, we were in relatively good shape, as opposed to others who realized that they couldn't even access their call tree, or they didn't even have one. Right? And that was one of the things that came out of the FCA guidance is start with the basics. Don't start over engineering super complex things. Start with the things that are easy to fix. Do you have a call tree? And if your systems went offline, would you know who to call? Do you have contacts in your third parties? Do you have contacts in other parts of your organization? Who would you call? So that's always my encouragement to people is start with being really, really basic. Imagine that you're in that scenario. Something is broken and things have gone bad. What is the first thing you do? And actually, can you do it?
And it's so interesting because I have been on the other side, right? And I remember all of these cultures, we would do BCP testing. And I remember all of that stuff. And I mean, gosh, we have a call tree for Girl Guides. It is the basics. And I think it's interesting, right? Because the numbers 2 and 3 on your list, Chris, right? Stressed exit and scenario testing, I think actually kind of go hand in glove. And I think everybody's been focusing on that stress testing, that stressed exit scenario piece. And to your point, creating 600-page documents on it. And in fact, we were talking the other day about the GFMA paper, which said application portability is impossible, right? Instead of thinking about exactly what you've just articulated, and they've gone straight down to the solution, the classic engineering stuff. Without understanding the problem, here's the solution. The solution is application portability. Well, what's the problem? Do you even need to have application portability for this? What about these other things in place that you could do to essentially do the same thing that you would need to achieve from having application portability? And GFMA came out and said it's not possible. Now, we all know that it is completely possible. What is not possible is if, when you said the context and the decisions about technology are not joined up, the people implementing them are not joined up, and then you fixate on the solution instead of actually understanding the problem and what really needs to be achieved. And again, I find all that fascinating because actually it comes back to people. It has nothing to do with technology. It comes back to people, culture, how decisions are being made, and who wants to come out of their silo and hold hands with another function to ultimately make sure that none of us are harmed. Because at the end of the day, I care deeply about this because guess what? I have a mortgage, I have a pension, I have investments. We all do. I have a bank account. We all do. And we all rely so much on digital money now. If this goes belly up, we're all stuffed. So I think all of these things kind of really, like I said, we focused on stressed exit because I think that's where we were pointed to solve the problem. But actually nobody really articulated what the problem was. And I think the better way to look at it is through this scenario testing lens. And rather than part of you goes, we shouldn't fixate on the black swan events. Okay, well, Chris, you've already pointed out we've had lots of black swan events. Are they black swan events or are they gray swan events? We could argue over and over again what they are. But I do think it's that figuring out what the plausible scenarios are. You said the P word, and I think that's the way, to think about it and then figure out how you almost get to be creative in how you solve it rather than doubling down on this is not possible, we can't do this bit, which is where I think we're kind of getting stuck in this loop. So Chris, I know you feel passionate about this like Anne and I do.
No, absolutely. And I think, look, I always go back to Terry Pratchett on this one because I think he said that basically it's amazing how 100-year events seem to always come around every 10 years. For example, right? So, and he's lots more wisdom than that. But it's really important to echo what you've both been saying. This is about culture and joining the dots together and working together and integrating. And this is where Operation Resilience 2.0 is going, right? Very, very quickly is integrating, for example, between operational resilience, operational risk, thinking about that interaction between financial resilience because it has to impact liquidity or it has to impact consumers, thinking about, but that's a different risk lens sometimes because what we're doing here is we're not thinking about likelihood, we're thinking about impact, and it's impact first, likelihood second, which then pulls us back into, okay, plausibility is such a hard and actually subjective area, but that's why you need to have an integrated approach on that. You need different people approaching this from different angles help you to try to detect where is the line of plausibility on this, right? Where are we going to put that? And we can revise that, and we can choose to revise that with new information and better understanding, more sophistication. But to your point, it's more, don't try for perfection in this area. There's too many variables. It's too complex to try to be perfect. Win ugly, right? I think it's really important it's more important to be practical, get those sleeves rolled up, get your hands dirty, and work together to try to find out where are the actual potential breaking points and what will we do about them. And those solutions do not have to be gold-plated. They don't have to be perfect. Again, it's about keeping harm below intolerability. And that might mean it's a gray outage. It might mean that you have some features are just not there. We're talking inconvenience, and we're not talking impacts to consumer. We're not creating intolerable consumer harm. We're not creating huge impacts to market integrity that disrupt that, or financial instability. It's about keeping it within that tolerable level, right? To do that, you need risk involved, you need security involved, you need your dev guys, you need the engineers, but you need to have that proportionality is determined by, well, what's that outside impact? If we don't know that, then what's the right option to play with here? And the regulators are expecting a risk-based approach. They're expecting that proportionality, and they're expecting it to be tested. You cannot test 600 pages. I'm very sorry for that person for what they've gone through. I really am. You cannot test 600 pages, and the regulators will not be impressed with 600 pages that are just a paper-based capability. Paper-based will not win. Win ugly.
Totally. And on that, I had a conversation with a former banking supervisor recently, and what she shared with me was that she's the most alarmed when when she used to do on-site inspections, and she'd go in and basically there would be a well-rehearsed team and it's all been scripted, and basically the message is nothing to see here. We're vulnerable nowhere. Everything is under control. Like, they're not fools. And anybody who knows anything about security is going to know that there are unpatched vulnerabilities. There is mess. There is always going to be a level of things that just never quite get dealt with perfectly. The most alarming thing is when there's denial about that. Because if you're able to say, we know what we have in the backlog, and we have what we believe is a well-informed, risk-based filter for us to be able to sift through it and pick out the things that we know that if we don't deal with them, they're really going to hurt us, and they could potentially hurt beyond us. That's reassuring, way more reassuring than nothing to see here. When people are rating themselves 4.8 out of 5 on a maturity scale, okay, wow, well done. But that's would have alarm bells ringing, not just for me. I think it would have alarm bells ringing for a lot of people. So it's being willing and confident to be able to say, we know what our problems are, and here's how we're going about fixing them. That's a much better path forward. That win ugly phrase of Chris's, absolutely, is we know what we have to do, and we have a plan to deal with it. We know what it means to set certain things to one side. Yes, we might get it wrong, but we have good enough MI to be able to see when we're getting it wrong, and we will course correct quickly. That's a much really more satisfying narrative, I think. If you're going
to really quickly beyond that, right? You cannot get this all right. You cannot expect to be right all the time. But those reasonable steps, right? When I used to be a supervisor, if I saw a dashboard of green indicators, everything's green. To your point, Anne, that was when I was most worried. So be realistic, and it's that learning journey, and being willing to accept culturally that there will be things that will go wrong. It's not possible to be strong everywhere all the time. And if everything's changing, how do you stay on top of that change and as resiliently as possible to take the reasonable steps to give yourself the best chance And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I've been listening to you two, and again, this is like the highlight of my week. Your partners may or may not agree with me, but I love having these conversations with you two, and it's very rare that the three of us come together. But I think just kind of recognizing the fact that we're half an hour in, and I wanted to kind of summarize 5 or 6 really good takeaways, I think. Because we can all sit here and say the number one takeaway is have application portability. Number 2 is do this. No. I actually think there's some really good principles here. And I think the first one is context is key, right? And part of it is context is now, but it's also about how decisions were made in the past, how we've implemented them. And I just, we could sit there and talk about context is key for another hour, and we're not going to. But I do think it's worth appreciating the context piece. The second one is, I love this, right? We've talked about this before a lot, Anne, is the connective tissue, right? It's that muscle memory as well. It's all these athlete, analogies really do matter, right? You have to practice this stuff, and you have to make it part of your DNA, and you have to make it so that it's not scary or bad. And even if you do win ugly, it's still okay because you still won. And I think that's where a lot of these sport analogies and the human body stuff kind of come together. The next one for me is, your operational resilience has to couple with the business, right? It has to be, and that's kind of part of that whole integration piece that you talk about, Chris. When I talk with clients now about cloud, for example, they just add a different kind of risk onto a risk register. No, you can't do that, right? All of this technology is connecting us, and therefore risk management now has to be integrated. So you need to have it integrated across the entire organization, and it has to filter all the way through to your contracts, to financial risk, to all of these things, to balance sheet risk, all of these things. And then I think, the last one, or the fourth one, I think for me is this baby steps piece, right? It's how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And you have to be open and honest with your regulators and say, it's a big elephant. We're only going to get 10% of it done this year. We've got a plan to do the other 50% next quarter, whatever, blah, 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 right? And I think if you're open and honest, you'll get a better reaction. That's been my experience anyway, specifically in the UK. And the last thing is know thyself. So I'm going to end it there, but thank you both very much. Some people will either have loved or hated this conversation and want to buy each of us a beer or a glass of wine afterwards. But I've honestly love having to chat with both of you. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you all for listening to us talk about operational resilience.